One of my favorite features of Next.js is its built-in file-based routing system. As coming to Next.js from just vanilla React, I was so used to needing to install React Router DOM or some other routing solution, and then doing kind of all the boilerplate necessary to get that all set up. And over time, it just kind of becomes pretty tedious to do, and it feels like you're doing the same thing in every single project you use. But in Next.js, it works differently, and I love it so much more than just using vanilla React. So today's video is going to be about this Next.js fundamental of defining routes. Now, there's definitely more to routing than what we're going to cover here, as you can get a little advanced with routing when it comes to parallel routes and route intercepts and all that stuff, which I definitely will cover. But for now, we're just going to cover the fundamentals of like, how do you create different routes in Next.js? So we're going to cover these kind of three main points here and then get into some examples. So I just created this kind of demo project here on Localhost 3000 that we're going to kind of show examples of. So number one, as I kind of alluded to, Next.js has a built-in file-based routing systems where folders are used to define routes. And how this works is that each folder represents a route segment and maps to a URL. You're then going to nest folders to create nested routes. So what I mean by each folder represents a route segment is that if you create a folder that is named settings, or the name of that folder is called settings, then that route segment can map to a actual URL like /settings. And then if you want to create nested routes like /patient/profile, well, in your Next.js project, which I'll show you this in a second, you just create a folder called patient, and then within that patient folder, you'd create a profile folder, and that automatically maps to /patient/profile. Now, one key thing to remember here, as I close these other drop downs, is that adding a folder doesn't automatically add a public route. You need to add a page.js or TS or JSX or TSX file to make that route publicly accessible. So if you create that patient folder, well, you're not going to have like a /patient route or a URL to go to, or that's accessible publicly, until you actually add a page.file within that folder. However, you could have a folder that has one of these page.files in it, but you could explicitly make that folder private by adding an underscore, prefixing the folder name with an underscore. So let's kind of get into examples of this. So first, let's just show you like what folder is going to map to this home page, and then I'll also show you a settings page that I have set up. So if I go to the code here in VS Code, what you're going to see is I have my home page here. I have my drop-down titles, my drop-down content, and this represents my homepage. You can see Next.js fundamentals, defining routes. It is the same thing that we see right here. So that is indeed my homepage. Now here in Next.js, we have our app folder, and we're on Next.js 15, the latest Next.js version at the time of recording this. And in this app folder, you can see at the root of this folder, at the kind of top level of this folder, we have some other folders here, but we also have a page.tsx file, as I'm using TypeScript in this project. So this page.tsx file in the root of my app folder, well, that is just going to map to my home page, just at /. So at localhost 3000, this is the root of my app folder, and it's going to show this page.tsx file that I have. So here, in this page.tsx file, I just export default my homepage component, and this is what is going to show on my home page right here. It is at the root of my app folder. But now let's say I want to create a /settings route. Well, what I would do is within my app folder, I'm going to create another folder within my app directory that is called settings. And then within my settings folder, I just added page.tsx file within here. And this could, of course, be a JS or JSX or TS file as well. But I have this settings page to where I have a React component settings page. I export default, that settings page. So if we go to /settings, since I have a page.file within this settings folder within my app directory, we should see this component being rendered to the page. So if we go to my app and I go to /settings, we see my settings page here. So it is as easy as that to create your different routes in Next.js. It just gives you that out of the box. I didn't have to do any kind of boilerplate setup there, which is super nice. So we looked at the homepage and the settings page, but now let's look at private folders and inaccessible folders with components and fonts. So as you saw here, I had to add this page.file so I could actually go to /settings. But what about this fonts folder? This fonts folder doesn't have a page.file within it, but it is still in the app directory. So if I try to access this fonts folder, what do you think is going to happen here? Well, if you were listening carefully earlier, it's not going to be publicly accessible. I get 404, page cannot be found. And that's because my fonts folder here does not have a page.file within it. If I went ahead and added a page.tsx file within my fonts folder, and I export a default function called fonts, and I just return an H1 saying fonts page, and now I go back to the browser, you see at /fonts, I see this fonts page here. So we made it publicly accessible by adding this page.tsx file. But if I remove this and I move that to trash, and now this fonts folder no longer has a page.file in it, and I come back to my browser, you're going to see that I get 404. This page could not be found. So you need to add a page.file within a folder to actually make it accessible via your URL. Now, we also have this components folder, and we do have a page.tsx file within it to where we just show an H1 with components page. So if I go to /components, we would expect to see this. And what we are going to see is exactly that, components page. But I can make this an explicitly private folder by renaming this and adding an underscore in front of components. That is telling Next.js that even if this folder has a page.file within it, it's going to be private. It's not publicly accessible. So what you see now is that this page cannot be found at /components. Even though I have a page.file within it, it's not going to be publicly accessible because I prefixed the folder name with an underscore. And I really like this pattern. If you're going to have a folder that just contains like components that you're going to use throughout your application, I really like the pattern of explicitly saying, hey, this folder is meant to be a private folder just for components. It's not going to be a publicly accessible route within your application. So you can make a folder private with prefixing the folder name with an underscore. And even if you have a page.file within it, it's not going to make that a publicly accessible route. But now as the final example here, let's come back and make sure I'm not forgetting anything. The final example is going to be looking at nested routes with patient /profile. So if we want to create nested routes, we have this patient folder and we have a page.tsx file within this patient folder. So if I go to /patient, I should see this component rendered to the page because I export default, this patient homepage component. So if we go to /patient, what we see is this patient dashboard here. It's what I'm rendering here on this page. And again, that's because we have a folder with a page.file within it. So this route is going to map to this name of this folder. So within our app directory, it's going to be /patient that it's going to map to. And it's going to render this page.tsx file. But now if I want to create a URL called /patient and then /profile, I would just add a profile folder within my patient folder. So this is going to map to /patient /profile. And then within my profile folder, I of course add a page.tsx file to make this a publicly accessible route at /patient/profile. So if we go to that route, we should see this patient profile page here that I'm exporting within this page.file within my profile folder. So if I go to /profile, we do indeed see this patient profile page. So creating nested routes is basically the same way you define any routes, but you just create folders within folders and then create page.files within those folders. And that's going to create nested routes. And if we wanted to take this further, maybe we want to add a settings page. So /patient/profile/settings. Well, within my profile folder, we just add another nested folder that's going to be settings. And then let me just go ahead and within our settings page, I'm going to just copy this. And then within my settings folder, we need to add a page.tsx file. And then I'll just render this settings page. So if I go to /patient/profile/settings, I should see this rendered page.tsx file. So if I go to /settings now, you see my settings page here. So nesting routes is as easy as just nesting folders. It's going to map just kind of as you would expect intuitively. So as a quick recap here for defining routes, Next.js has a built-in file-based routing system where folders are used to define different routes. And the way it works is that each folder represents a route segment and maps to a URL. So if you create a folder within your application called settings, and you create a page.file within that folder, then it's going to create a route. As long as that folder is within your app directory, it's going to create a route at /settings that you can access. And then if you want to nest routes, you can do what we just did here earlier to where we just create folders within folders that contain that page.file as well within those folders. Now you can also be explicitly private about your folders by prefixing them with an underscore, just like what we do here with our components folder. Even though this has a page.file within it, it is going to remain private here because we prefix it with an underscore. And then even if you have a folder like our fonts folder within your app directory, if you don't add a page.file within it, it is not going to make it publicly accessible. If you're using the underscore pattern, then you might just make this underscore fonts to explicitly say that, hey, this is not going to be a public route. It is just going to be a private folder that we have within our app directory. So that is defining routes in Next.js. There's definitely more to know here, but this really should get you quite a ways, and it's going to be some fundamentals that you're going to use in probably all of your Next.js applications. At this point, I'm guessing you know what a page is, but real quick, it just represents some unique UI for a given route. So here at Locos 3000, everything we see here is just some UI for a given route. In this case, our home route. If I go to settings, this is a settings page, just unique UI for /settings. I go to /patient, same sort of deal. This patient dashboard page is just UI for a given route. And in Next.js, the way you create these pages is all you need to do is within your app directory, you create a page.js, JSX, or TSX file, which is one kind of little important note there is that these pages can have those 3 different file extensions. And then once you create this file, you just export a component from it. And then once you do this, this will automatically create a new route matching the name of the folder. So as I showed you earlier, we have this Locos 3000 and we showed this page here. If I go to VS Code and we're in our app directory, and I'm at our root of our project here. So this is the top level of our app folder. I have this page.tsx file and I export this homepage component here and we return this JSX here, which gets converted into what you see on the page. This is the UI that the user is going to see when they visit just / our homepage. And as you can see here, Next.js fundamental pages, Next.js fundamental pages, it is indeed the UI that you see. And now if I go to /settings, the way that we create this page, if I go to VS Code, within an app directory, I have a settings folder. I have a page dot, in this case, TSX, but like I said earlier, it could be JS or JSX as well. And then I export this settings page component from my page.tsx within my settings folder. And this is the UI that you see for my settings page here. And then the very same thing for my patient page. I just have a patient folder within my app directory and a page.tsx file within it. Now you can have nested routes and stuff like that, but I kind of cover all that in my previous video. Now, a couple of other things to know about pages in Next.js. A route will not have public access until you create a page.file within that folder. So if we look within our app directory here, I have this fonts folder, as you can see here, but there is not a page.file within this fonts folder. So if I try to go to something like /fonts, I get a 404 because we don't have a page.file within our fonts folder. So this is not going to be public, even though it's within the app directory. If I went ahead and added a page.tsx file and I export a default function, fonts page, and then we just like return an H1 that says fonts page, I save that, and then let me refresh this. What we're going to see is we do now have a fonts page because I'm exporting a component from this page.tsx file within my fonts folder. Now I could explicitly make this a private folder, like what I do here with components, by just renaming it and adding an underscore in front of it. And even if I have a page.tsx file within this folder, like I do, it's not going to be publicly accessible because I add an underscore as a prefix to the folder name. And then I come back to the browser. You're going to see that I get a 404 again because I added that underscore to our fonts page. And even if I try to go to like, instead of fonts, I tried to go to underscore fonts, you're going to see it's still going to give a 404, even though this matches the folder name, because I prefix it with an underscore. So it effectively makes this a non-public route, even though I have a page.file within it. And then pages by default, they're going to be server components, but can be switched to client components by adding use client to the top of the file. If you're not familiar with server and client components, I'm going to cover this in a lot more depth in future videos, but just know that by default, when I create a page like this, it's going to be rendered on the server. However, as in my root page component, I can add use client to the top of the file if your page is going to be a little bit more dynamic, and that's going to make this a client component and opt out of the default behavior of making it a server component. And then finally, it's pretty common to see data being fetched directly from your pages, as these are server components by default. So it's kind of a good place to do some of your data fetching. So something that you might see if I go to my settings page is I could just make this an async function here. And then at the top of the file, you might say const res equal to await. And then you might fetch some data here and then use that within your component. And you can fetch that data directly here within the server component, rather than what you might need to do with a client component with using something like a use effect from React, and then kind of do that whole sort of thing. Now, if this was a client component, you might need to do something like that. But I think for the most part, you can kind of do a lot of your data fetching within a server component and just fetch it directly, maybe within a page itself, like what I'm doing here. And it kind of prevents you from needing to use a use effect, which is kind of nice. So that is pages in React. I know that a lot of this is probably review and maybe not so new to a lot of you, but I think this should be a kind of a good overview of just what pages are, how to create them, and a few different points regarding pages. So I hope this helps you out and maybe provides good review for you, but we're about to get into some more complexities when it comes to routing and stuff like that in Next.js. So Next.js gives you an out-of-the-box solution for creating layouts. And a layout is effectively just going to be some UI, some structure of your page, something that the user sees, some UI that is shared between multiple routes. And the way that a layout works is that you use a Next.js file convention and create a layout.ts, tsx, or jsx file. And then you just export a React component from that file. So very similar to how you would create a page.tx file. But the difference with the layout is that the layout is going to be shared among all pages throughout that route segment. And here we're looking at, in my kind of demo application here, this is going to be the root layout, which the root layout is going to be required, and it's going to be shared through all of our different route segments within our app. So if the user navigated to /blog/dashboard here, it is going to see this root layout. Now, one important aspect of not necessarily a root layout, but any layout within your application is that it is automatically going to be passed the children prop, and then you need to make sure to render that children prop within your application. I'll show you what happens here in a sec if you don't do that. But just make sure that this children prop within your layouts is definitely something that you're going to want to make sure that you pass through and render somewhere within your layout. Now, coming back to this root layout a little bit more specifically, so this is going to be defined at the top level of your application. So right within my app folder, it's going to be the top level layout. In my case, I'm using TypeScript, so layout.tsx file. And in the root layout, it is required and it must contain both an HTML tag as well as body tags. And when doing this, this can allow you to modify the initial HTML that's returned from the server as well. So in your root layout, the most top level layout, you're going to need to have one in your application. And then also you're going to want to make sure that this has the HTML and body tags, and that if you customize this layout like I have here, that you make sure that you don't get rid of those tags, because those must be contained within your root layout. Now I'm going to show you the running application here and some examples of this in a second. But before we get to that, you could also create nested layouts. And all you do for this is very similar to how you add pages in Next.js. Within a certain route segment or a folder within your app directory, all you're going to do is create another layout.ts or JSX or TSX file within that folder. So here I have a dashboard folder or a dashboard route segment, and then a layout.tsx file within it. I'm going to click on it here. And then this is going to be a layout or some shared UI that is going to be shared within all pages and routes within my dashboard route segment. So this layout right here within my dashboard, this is effectively going to wrap the page.js file within my dashboard, but it's also going to wrap my settings here as well as my about page. So dashboard/about and dashboard/settings are both going to contain the UI that is in this dashboard layout, because this layout is going to be shared UI for everything within my dashboard route segment. However, in my blog route segment that is outside of my dashboard, this is not going to contain this layout here because it's a sibling of my dashboard. It is not contained within the dashboard route segment. And then we can take this further to where within my dashboard, we have a settings route segment. And then within settings, we have another layout. So this is going to be a layout that is specific to /dashboard/settings. So it's going to be UI that applies to my settings page within my dashboard route. And if I took this even further and say you had /dashboard /settings / profile, then this layout here would apply to that profile page. And then just keep in mind that for this settings page here, all the way down with my dashboard / settings page, this page is going to contain the UI from my root layout. So my root layout is going to apply to everything within my blog route segment, everything within my dashboard route segment. And later in this video, I'll just kind of roughly go over some things that are good to know about layouts. And then it's also going to cover my about page, my settings page, and everything within there. Let's start with our root layout here and just look at what these kind of look like, the effect these have on a running application. So my root layout, it basically renders a header here with just a couple of links, a link to home, dashboard, and blog. We see at my home page here, locos 3000, we see home, dashboard, and blog. So that is just my root layout rendering this top header component. Now here you see layouts, learn everything you need to know about layouts in Next.js. If we come back, that is actually the content of my home page here. Layouts, learn everything you need to know about Next.js. Now, what happens if I forget to render this children prop right here and I get rid of this? We see I don't see that content anymore from my home page. And the reason for that is because your layout is effectively a wrapper component around all of your pages in that route segment. And the root layout is going to wrap around layouts that are nested within your application. So the root layout is going to wrap around a layout in our blog. It's going to wrap around our dashboard layout. And our dashboard layout is going to wrap around our settings layout and our settings page. So these layouts are kind of like wrapper components. And when you use wrapper components, you need to make sure to render the children prop here, or else you're going to lose the content of which the layout is wrapping around. So this is our root layout here. And if I go to my dashboard, okay, we're going to see some new stuff here. Let's go look at the dashboard layout. So here we see that it renders this dashboard text and then a settings and about navigation, which is kind of like this secondary header right here. And I'm not saying this is the best UI in the world. It's just for example purposes. But when we go to our dashboard page, we still see our root layout as you would expect, but we also see this dashboard layout, which is like this secondary header. Now, if we go further and we go to my settings page, we see another like little piece of UI here. And if I go to my settings layout, you can see that it renders a side navigation or a sidebar here, which is exactly what you see right here along the side. So on my settings page here, dashboard / settings, we still see our root layout. We see our dashboard layout because we're in the dashboard route segment. We're / dashboard / settings. But now we also see the settings layout and then just some content for my settings page. Now, if we come back to dashboard, you no longer see the settings layout because we're not at the settings route anymore. And then if I go to my about page, which is just / dashboard / about, we don't, of course, see the settings layout or the settings sidebar because that's specific to / settings, but we still see the dashboard layout as well as the root layout here up at the top. And then if we navigate all the way out of dashboard and we just go to / blog, you see this doesn't have a layout of itself. It just has the root layout. And that's because the blog, it's not in the dashboard route segment. It's not in any other route segment that contains a layout. So it just has the root layout here. So fairly straightforward here. For your layouts, you just create a layout.tsx or ts or jsx file. And then that is just going to be some shared code that wraps around that given route segment. So the root layout is going to wrap around all of your different route segments. For our layout within our dashboard folder, this is going to be a layout that wraps around all of our dashboard route segments. So it's going to wrap around dashboard page as well as our nested dashboard pages. So dashboard/about, dashboard/settings, and so on and so forth. Now for just a few things that are good to know here before we end this video, straight from the Next.js docs, I'm just going to run through these. But if you want to check this out, I'll make sure to link the docs here. But as I've kind of mentioned, JS, JSX, or TSX file extensions can be used for layouts. I might have been saying TS and TSX, but it looks like it is just these 3 file extensions. So if I was saying TS and not JS earlier, that is my mistake. It is JS, JSX, or TSX files. Only the root layout can contain HTML and body tags, and it must contain those. When a layout.js and page.js file are defined in the same folder, the layout will wrap that page file, which we discussed. Layouts are server components by default, but can be client components. Layouts can fetch data. Passing data between a parent layout and its children is not possible. However, you can fetch data in a route in more than kind of one place, and React will automatically dedupe those requests. So if you need the same data in like a layout and a child component, you can just fetch that data in both of those, and React will make sure that there's not multiple requests being made. Layouts do not have access to path name, but imported client components can access the path name using the use path name hook. Layouts do not have access to route segments below itself. To access all route segments, you can use selected layout segment or use selected layout segments in a client component. You can use route groups to opt out specific route segments in and out of shared layouts. So say you have a certain route segment that you don't want the root layout to apply to, you can use route groups to do that, which I'll cover this in more detail in a later video. And then you can also use route groups to create multiple root layouts, which is also pretty cool, and we'll cover that more in the future. So just some good things to know there, but hopefully this gives you a good kind of overview of what layouts are, and really it's fairly straightforward. It's very similar to using pages, but just for more so kind of shared UI between entire route segments. So in my previous Next.js video, we discussed the idea of layouts and how you can use layouts in Next.js, a specific layout file, to share parts of your user interface across several different route segments. So you could create a layout in this dashboard folder, and then this layout here is going to be shared across all the different routes and all the different pages within your dashboard folder. And how you also have this root layout, to where this root layout is going to be some UI here that is shared throughout all of your different pages throughout your application. That's great and all, but Next.js also has this idea of templates. So straight from the Next.js docs here, templates are very similar to layouts, basically the same as layouts, to where they wrap child layouts or pages. But unlike layouts that persist across routes and maintain state, templates create a new instance for each of their children on navigation. Meaning, when a user navigates between routes that share a template, a new instance of the child is mounted, DOM elements created, and state is not preserved in client components. You might specifically want to use a template instead of a layout when you want to resynchronize the use effect on navigation, or to reset the state of child client components on navigation. And those are really the kind of core differences there. Now, a template can be defined the same way that you kind of would do a layout. You just create a template.js or TSX file or JSX file instead of a layout.dot file. So if we look at our application here, let's show you an example of kind of the actual practical differences of this. In our dashboard layout, we render this navlinks component, and this is a client component where you can see use client here at the top. We use this use path name hook from React to set different kind of background colors for these links. Then also on mount here, we console log mounting, and then we also set the active link right here to whatever the link title is from the path name. So we have this link title state, On mount, we set this little title name here, just for this example, to whatever the end of the path name is. So if we come look at this in our running application, I'm going to open my console like so, and I'm going to clear my console, and I'm going to do a hard refresh on my page of Command-Shift-R. And we see it mounted once. And then if I go back and forth between about and settings here, you see that it's not actually console logging mounting, because it's not going to remount and re-render this navlinks component within my dashboard layout here, because it's just a layout.tsx file. So since this navlinks is a child client component, it's not going to remount it on navigation here. But if I change this to a template.tsx file, what you're going to immediately see here, if I come back to my app, I'm going to clear my console and I'm going to do a hard refresh on my page. You're going to see that I get the mounting. I also see it sets my active link here to settings, because it's actually remounting this component. And if I shift to about here, it switches my active link to about, and you see it console log mounting again, settings, console logs mounting again, active link settings, about, about. You can see that it's remounting this component, and it's recalling the use effect hook here on mount. So that is one of the kind of core differences there between a layout and a template. It is going to effectively remount its children client components on those navigation events. And if I just go back to switching this from a template back to a layout here, so we can just see those changes one more time, and then we come back, let me clear the console, and now let me start switching back. You see that it just stays at the active link of about here, because it's not remounting and it's not updating or calling that use effect hook on mount, because it's just staying mounted. The state is remaining preserved, and it's not console logging the mounting, because it's not running this use effect hook, because this component is just staying mounted when it's rendered within a layout instead of being rendered within a template. So hopefully that gives you a good kind of more practical example of just the little subtle differences between layouts and templates in Next.js. And just to kind of recap them, templates are effectively layouts in Next.js. You can use them for really the same things. However, for a template, it is going to create a new instance for each of their children on navigation, which is why we were just seeing the behavior that we were just seeing. So for its children, it is going to remount those components, recreate those DOM elements, and state is not going to be preserved, and effects are going to be resynchronized. So if you have children client components to where on navigation you really want them to resynchronize their effects, use a template. Also, if you want to reset the state of those client components on navigation, use a template. Else, I'm probably going to just default to using a layout. But if it's not giving you the behavior you want and you want to do kind of one of these two things, then using a template might be the solution you go for. So hopefully this video kind of helps clear up the difference between templates and layouts in Next.js. It is pretty subtle, but it can be kind of the solution that you need once you are experiencing an undesirable behavior when using layouts. In any modern application, you're going to need some way to link between your different pages to allow a user to navigate between different pages. And in Next.js, they give you a link component kind of right out of the box. Now, if we go to their docs here, you'll see that link is a built-in component that extends the HTML A tag to provide prefetching and client-side navigation between routes. It is the primary and recommended way to navigate between routes in Next.js. And the very basic example of it is you import link from next link, and then you render it somewhere within your page, wherever you want a link to be. And then you provide an href to that link. And this can just be a relative path to where you want to navigate to. So in this example, href equals string / dashboard would link the user to your / dashboard page. And I'm of course going to show some different examples of this as well. But to go to the actual link API here within the Next.js docs. So I'll make sure to link both of these in the description below. I kind of discussed the basic usage right here, but there are some different props that you can pass to the link component. So the first one, of course, is the href prop, and that's basically where you want to navigate to. So /dashboard is going to navigate you to the /dashboard page. Now you can customize this a little bit more to where you can actually pass an object to href, and then one property of that object can be path name, and that links to whatever path name you want to navigate to. But then you can add query parameters by adding a query prop name, and then that can be an object to where you can have key value pairs of what you want your query parameter to be. So if we added this href right here, it would link us to /about, and then for a query parameter, it would put name is equal to test. So in my code here, you can see that I have this link examples page, and I use this link component, importing it from NextLink, and I'm in a server component here. So this is a great way to navigate server side, as there are other ways to do programmatic navigation in Next.js, but some of those are going to be client side. But here you can see I render this link component. I have my href, I pass in an object to my href prop. One of the properties of the object is a /about string on my path name property. So it's going to link to /about. And then my other property is query, and the key value pair is name test. So if we come back to my running application, if I click on go to about page with query params, and I go to my very elaborately styled about page here, and I just scroll down there quick so you can actually see my URL. Makes sense on a video regarding linking. But here we have about $name equals test. So you can see here again, if I click this link, it adds these query params because I added query, name is test. If I switch this to maybe Code Ryan, and then I click this link again, you can see my name is equal Code Ryan now, because I just changed the value of my name property within my query property for my href. So you can customize this href prop a little bit more. Now, what you could also do is we can use the replace property, and using replace will replace the current history of the state instead of adding a new entry. So this is going to be similar to using like window.replace in just basic HTML. And if we scroll down to my example here, you can see that I have a link component, and then I have an href /dashboard. So I want to navigate to the dashboard, and you can put your classes for your CSS or Tailwind CSS. This example is Tailwind, but you can style these links directly, just like you might with an A tag. But then I add this replace prop. So if we look at the behavior of this, and I think this one's easier to just see the behavior of it. If I click replace here, it navigates to my dashboard as we expect. But if I hit this back button, you can see that it doesn't go anywhere because it replaced the current browser history. So no longer does the browser history have that I was sitting on localhost. It just has /dashboard because it replaced it. It doesn't just add it to the browser history. So when I click the back button, I have nowhere to go back to because it just replaced it. So if we do this again, if I click replace, try to hit back, see it doesn't go anywhere because it replaced it. But if I look at my first example where I don't use the replace prop and I navigate to my about page and then I click the back button, you see it takes me back to localhost 3000 because I didn't use the replace prop there. It just added it to the browser history or the browser stack. But in this case, it replaced it. So it doesn't really have any localhost to go back to because it replaced it with /dashboard. And there are some cases where you might want to use that. Now you can also use the scroll prop. So this one is a little kind of nuanced at times to where you can definitely read about the scroll prop more kind of in their docs here. And I'll link this API reference in the docs where you can kind of learn more about it. But to kind of give you the TLDR here of what this says, the default behavior or scrolling behavior of link is to maintain scroll position. So when you navigate to a new page, scroll position will stay the same as long as the page is visible in the viewport. But if that's not visible, it tries to scroll it to the top of the page or to the top of the first element on the page. But when scroll is false, it doesn't attempt to scroll to the top of the page. So in our example here, I'm going to scroll down. And if we look at my code here, down to the scroll example, you can see it's linking to dashboard. And then I set scroll to equal false. And that's for this link right here. So I'm going to scroll down here as so, and then I'm going to click navigate without scrolling. And you can see here on the dashboard page, it kind of just put me in the middle of the page, like it maintained this scroll position here to where it didn't scroll me all the way to the top. It links me a little bit down on the page here. So when scroll is to false, it's not going to scroll you back up to the top of the page if the page is not visible in the viewport. But if I come back to my code and I comment this line of code out, and then we come back and I'm going to refresh just to make sure everything is kind of reset here. But if now on the scroll button, I click on it, you see it scrolls me to the top of my dashboard page because I now have that default scrolling behavior enabled. And if I make it false again, and then we come back and I refresh here quick, and then I click on it, you see that it puts me kind of more in the middle of the page because with it being set to false, it no longer is going to scroll me back up to the top of the page. So a behavior that sometimes you might want to have. Now, for the prefetch prop, I don't have a great example hooked up to this right now, but I feel like it's fairly straightforward from their docs here, to where prefetching happens when a link component enters the user's viewport. Next.js prefetches and loads the linked route and its data in the background to improve performance for client-side navigations. If the prefetch data has expired by the time the user hovers over a link, Next.js will attempt to fetch it again, and it is only enabled in production. So you can set this prefetch prop here. You can set it to 3 different values. Null is prefetch behavior depends on whether the route is static or dynamic. For static, the full route will be prefetched. For dynamic routes, the partial route down to the nearest segment with a loading JS boundary will be prefetched. And if it's set to true, the full route will be prefetched for both static and dynamic routes. For false, prefetching will never happen, both on entering the viewport and on hover. So basically, you can manipulate this prefetch prop here to determine the behavior of when you want Next.js to load that linked route that it has here in your href. So you can determine, like if my href is dashboard, do I want Next.js to kind of load that dashboard route ahead of time or in the background when my link kind of appears on the page, or how do I want that behavior to be? And for most use cases, I feel like you're just not going to manipulate this prefetch prop. I haven't really run into too many issues with it, but there, of course, could be times where you need to manipulate this. So just know that for the link component, you can manipulate that prefetching behavior. And I'll just, when the time comes, I'll just come check out the docs. But by default, you can just not set the prefetch prop and then see if you run into any issues. But it does kind of go to show it is important to kind of test your apps in production because certain behaviors like this can be a little bit different. But yeah, that basically covers the primary and recommended way to link in Next.js. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of how this link component works. And it should be basically everything you need to know to effectively use this component. So in my previous video on Next.js, we looked at using the link component. And that is a great method to navigate throughout your application. However, for kind of more dynamic routing logic, so, a user clicks on a button or, you have to push a user to a certain page after they do a certain action, you might want to use kind of programmatic navigation that is client side. And when doing that, you're probably going to want to use the use router hook in Next.js, as this is going to allow you to do more kind of dynamic routing logic within client components. The way that this is going to work, if we look at my running application here, you are going to import the use router hook from next/navigation. you're going to make sure that you're within a client component, because to use a React hook, you're going to need to be within a client component. And this is also going to be for more so client-side navigation. So it's going to have to be within a client component. So import use router from Next navigation, and then make sure you're within a client component using the use client directive at the top of your file. And then to gain access to different router methods, you're going to call the use router hook at the top of your component, just like you do with any other hooks. And then here I just say const router is equal to use router. It's effectively going to return an object that has different methods on it for performing dynamic client-side routing. So to kind of go over these different API methods here, if we come back, you're going to see we can call router.push. So on the return value of use router here, I can call router.push, and this is going to navigate to a new route. And I'll show you examples of this in a sec. And it's going to add a history entry, a browser history entry. So if you use router.push, you can hit the back button in your browser, and that's going to take you back to where you called router.push from. And when calling router.push, it's going to accept a string where you want to push the user to. And then you can also set whether you want to scroll. And we'll kind of cover the examples of this in a second. And then you also have router.replace, which is effectively the same thing as router.push, but it's going to navigate without adding history to the browser, which it'll make more sense when I cover this. But basically, if you hit the back button, it's not going to take you back to where you called router.replace, because it just replaces the browser history, doesn't add on top of it. And then you also have router.refresh, basically just refreshes the current route, very similar to like window.location.refresh. And then you also have router.back and router.forward. It allows you to navigate forward and backward through the browser history, similar to like hitting the back and forward buttons in the top of your browser. And then you also have router.prefetch, which prefetches a route for faster transitions. So to kind of go over different examples of these, and then we'll cover some good to know things here in a second as well towards the end. But for basic navigation, let's look at the code here. So right here, basic navigation, we're just going to call router.push and pass in a relative path. So in this case, I'm saying push to the /dashboard page. If you see my project here, we have a dashboard page.tsx. So it should push us to this dashboard page right here. So it's a page that just says dashboard at the top. And we're just using the router object that is returned from this use router hook. So we call router.push dashboard. If we come back, I click go to dashboard, you see we go to /dashboard. If I hit the back button, it takes us back to localhost 3000 because that's where we called router.push on. So just basic client-side navigation there. Now we can also do it replacing the history. So in our next example, we call router.replace for the on-click on this button. And we just pass in the dashboard href. So navigate to /dashboard. If we click on this, we still go to /dashboard. But if I click on the back button here, you see that it doesn't take me anywhere because it just replaced the browser history. It didn't add a new entry in the browser history. So it doesn't really know that we came from localhost 3000, just our home page, because it replaced that history. It just now thinks it's at dashboard and there's no kind of localhost 3000 that we came from. So if I do this again, replace, back, we see we don't go anywhere. Compared to if we use router.push, we push to the dashboard and then we come right back because it just pushes a new entry on the browser history stack. So replace can be used if you want that sort of behavior. And then for refresh, we're not going to see anything if we click on it, but if we open the network tab by doing inspect and then go into network, you're going to see if I click refresh, you see that it is refetching the data for the page here. So it is doing stuff, it is refreshing the page and refreshing the data, but we don't actually see the full page kind of reload like you might with window.location.reload. And then finally here, as our final example, I will close this. And then we can also disable scroll to top. So if we come here and for our refresh, I'm just calling router.refresh for refreshing the page. So you don't need to pass anything. It's just router.refresh and calling that. But for the scrolling, so I do router.push, but I set scroll to false. So as a second argument to your router.push, and this is the same thing for router.replace, you can pass a scroll for false, and this means that it won't automatically scroll to the top of the page that you're routing to. So see how I'm scrolled down here on my page? Well, if I go to my dashboard here without scrolling, you're going to see that I'm not scrolled to the top of the page here. It's still scrolled down, and then I can still scroll up. So if I come back, you see I'm scrolled down here a little bit, and I go to dashboard, and you see it's still scrolled down a little bit. But the default behavior here is if I use my first push to where I just go to router.push/dashboard, even if I'm scrolled down here, like I still am, if I click on this first one that's not setting scroll to false, you see that it scrolls me to the top of the page that I'm linking to. So by default, if you use router.push or router.replace, it is going to scroll you to the top of the page that you're routing to. But then if you set scroll to false as your second argument to router.push or router.replace, you're going to see that it maintains the scroll position here to where we kind of stay scrolled down. It doesn't scroll us to the top of the dashboard page. And then just some good things to know here about the use router hook that I thought are worth mentioning straight from the Next.js docs here. You must not send untrusted or unsanitized URLs to router.push or router.replace, as this can open your site to cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. So you should make sure that your URLs are sanitized and can be trusted when passing those to router.push and replace. Also, they kind of mention here that the link component automatically prefetches routes as they become visible in the viewport. So that could be kind of one reason why the link component is preferred rather than just using use router all the time. You can also use the link component in server components, which can definitely be beneficial. And then also the refresh could reproduce the same result if fetch requests are cached. Other dynamic APIs like cookies and headers could also change the response. So when using refresh, you need to kind of pay attention to how caching is behaving in your application, as that can maybe cause some discrepancies between how you think your page should get refreshed and how it actually is because of that caching behavior. So just a few good things to know there about the use router hook, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of how it works, how the different API methods work, and should give you enough information to get up and running with this use router hook. So thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.